Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Bone. I'm a professor at the School of Architecture here at Cooper Union and the director of the Cooper Union Institute for Sustainable Design. First off, I want to say the presentations have been so good this afternoon. It's really just incredible. It's a thrill to hear all of these different points of view and to see your work. It's really, really nice. So I'm happy to be a host and part of this event here. I'm going to take about the first 20 or 25 minutes of our presentation and give you a quick overview of one of the great urban water supplies on the planet. So let's start off by taking a look at an urban environment in a brackish lagoon. Not New York City, but Venice. For those of us who know the city, we know that it's a city of courtyards and piazzas. Virtually every quadrant of the city has its courtyard or its piazza. And for those of you who have traveled there, you know that every one of these courtyards has some kind of feature in the middle of it. Many tourists mistakenly think those features are pedestals for statues. You'll also notice that every one of these courtyards has these four features around the central pedestal. Beautiful pieces of Styrian marble set into the paving of the piazza base. Here's a more irregular piazza showing the same feature with the four figures around it. What those are is part of a brilliant water collection system that the Venetians employed. Lance Brown has seen this before, I think, when I talked about this up at City College. This is a layer of clay that keeps this collection basin impermeable to the salt waters moving in from the channels. These are the cisterns that are below those marble drain covers, so this allows the water that falls on the piazza to be initially collected in these cisterns, and then this is a gradiated sand bed that filters the water as it goes into the main well. This was the sole source of water for Venice at its peak. Now, I show this not because this is an elegant combination of urban architecture and infrastructure, which it is. It's magnificent. But it's also interesting because of the set of rules that they had in place for how they used these piazzas. Professor Zuliani and I, Professor Zuliani, who also teaches here at the School of Architecture, many years ago did summer workshops in Venice, and we had two young Venetian architects who told us that the municipal code of Venice at its peak was really the first green building code, and that the activities on these piazzas were very strictly regulated to protect water quality. There's even in the language that the density of cats on a piazza was controlled, because obviously the cat is a critical part of the urban ecology. You have to keep the rodents under control, especially a seaport place like this. But if you have too many cats, you begin to compromise the water quality in the well. Other activities, painting, and so on. So all of this, in terms of an informed water citizenry, this was an informed water citizenry. They all knew that they had to be very careful with the management of their water, because it was only the rainfall that came onto this island that made that possible. We also know that they had no sewage system, and oftentimes people say this is one of the horrors of Venice, but in fact their rules were very specific. You would only throw your night pans out when the tide was going out. So twice a day you would empty your chamber pans. And twice a day the city was totally flushed out, and the nutrients that the city were largely taking in from the seafood of the lagoon were returning to the lagoon. Let's look now at another island surrounded by brackish water. New York City. This is, of course, all salt water around here. The Hudson River, even though it's a freshwater river, the tidal flat goes 25 miles up from the harbor. I want to quickly look at the early part of the history of New York City. By about 1690, when we have the first maps of New York City, we're up to about 20,000 people. The first water consumption rate figures we have here are 1820. We're up to 123,000, 12 gallons per person per day. I'll talk a little bit about why we jump up to 78 gallons per person per day, and the population increases as the city moves on. This map is 1695. It predominantly features the primary wells of Lower Manhattan. New York City took its water from primitive wells that were put in the ground around the settlement. The urban structure was basically blocks of row houses and then internal courtyards where the animals and the gardens and the agricultural work was taking place. Also, the privies of the families were inside there, so the outhouses were in there. It wasn't long till these wells were completely contaminated. Also, tanneries and sail-making operations and all of this, they had very little connection between the operations around the wells and contamination to the well. And New York City from 1690 until really 1835, until the Croton water came into New York, had notoriously bad water. There were numerous epidemics, cholera amongst them. In a way, this is the cholera epidemic, and the slides I'm going to show right after this could be that trigger event that causes society to change. As you were saying in Los Angeles, that you're actually hoping for another year of drought, that there might be that trigger event. This was the trigger event. During this time, the late 1700s and early 1800s was a time primarily of scheming and scamming regarding New York City's water. The big scam during that period was by one Aaron Burr and his partner, Dr. Brown, who proposed a strategy. You know, when this was all happening, the citizens were crying for water. There were different ideas being floated around. Dr. Brown and Aaron Burr said, we will create a high-quality water supply system to supply the residents of New York City. He teamed up with Alexander Hamilton, his arch rival, and they went to the city council and they said, in exchange for the right to sell water bonds, we will build a water supply system. So this was unheard of at the time, that individuals, private companies would be able to raise funds by doing this. They effectively became a private bank at a time when there were no private banks being allowed. Well, they turned out to be very good at raising money and very bad at delivering water. The company they founded was the Manhattan Company. Its story is a glorious story that's told in detail in Gerard Capel's book, Water for Gotham. If you're interested in the details of water history, it's a wonderful book. The Manhattan Company became the Chase Manhattan Bank, who maintained reservoirs in the basement of their building up until like 1935 to protect that charter, which allowed them to raise money. They were so concerned because the deal was if you provided water, you could have this charter to do banking. Well, the Manhattan Company failed miserably. They installed wooden pipes around Lower Manhattan that were freezing in the winter and clogging with weeds and whatnot in the summer. A few more. I include these cholera drawings because this was a clinic right around the corner from Cooper Union here where these patients were being treated. The final trigger was the Great Fire of 1835 when 700 buildings in Lower Manhattan burned. The temperatures were 0 degrees outside, and they report that the copper roofs on the buildings were liquefied. It was, this is the Merchants Exchange burning down. The aftermath of this, the citizens came together and began to demand water. This was really that trigger point which brought the citizens together to say, we need a serious civic water supply system. To get that civic water supply system, New York City began to look off-island for the first time. So there had been a number of modest water supplies that were based on streams in Greenwich Village, based on the Collect Pond, which is down in the courthouse district in Lower Manhattan. But the plans that began to be studied in 1835 began to say, let's go off-island and let's look up here to the Croton watershed. Rich, verdant, hilly country with natural springs, many natural lakes, a reliable rainfall of about 48 inches a year. This map is actually of the new Croton Aqueduct, but the original Croton Aqueduct, which I'll show you quickly, came along the Hudson River here, a masonry structure at grade, and delivered water down to Manhattan. It changed the city forever. This is the dam that they built to contain that water. an innovative structure for the civil engineers that are in here. One of the problems with masonry containment structures, any water containment structure, is as the water spills over that structure, the energy tends to churn at the toe of that structure and undermine the foundation. And they created this kind of concept of a stilling spool, a stilling pool, where the water would circulate back on itself and grab that energy so that it wouldn't undermine the foundation. This photograph shows that the Croton River, when it's flooding, carries a lot of water. It's a very flashy river. It also shows Westchester when it's primarily agricultural land, when they're completely deforested. And it also shows the building of the new Croton Aqueduct, this first gatehouse here. Later on, the water levels in this photograph will be up to here or up to there, and these conduits here will be bringing water to New York City. The original Croton Aqueduct, a brick structure, horseshoe-shaped. Carried across the Harlem River by the High Bridge. This structure is still there. This structure is interesting for several reasons, not only because it's a glorious masonry structure in the grand Roman tradition of aqueducts, but there was a lot of argument that they're going to spend huge capital investment to build this waterworks and no one's going to see it, because the water was going to be carried across the Harlem River by a siphon that went underneath it. And there were those that argued on this panel that we needed a civic symbol that was an identity that people could recognize, where people could go for weekends and recreate here in the Harlem River. And that viewpoint prevailed, that infrastructure needs some identity. And I think that's an important lesson from all of this. They went on to build many other dams in the Croton watershed. Ultimately, about 20 dams and controlled lakes were built there. For the most part, traditional stone masonry structures. They were also having their maintenance problems early on. This is the Croton Aqueduct here. It was originally asked to carry, or designed to carry 70 million gallons of water per day. As water needs increased, as population increased, they pushed this up to 90 million gallons. And as they did, they began to push the top off of this aqueduct, because the design level was really about here at the spring line of the arches. So you can see here already this strategy of bringing in concrete to repair the aqueduct. This is a wonderful drawing. They were preparing to build a new reservoir in the center of Manhattan at the time that they began to talk about Central Park. And this drawing, those people involved with Central Park said, we want a natural figured storage containment basin, not this rectangular figure that was proposed by the aqueduct commissioners. So this is a verification of the swap of land for what is now the Central Park Reservoir for the exact same acreage that was covered by this original rectangular figure. And there are all of the citizens that signed off on this swap of land. This is a really wonderful historic document. And of course, that's what we're left with. This was the original receiving reservoir for the old Croton Aqueduct. Once it became overwhelmed, they began to expand with a second Croton Aqueduct and to add additional storage. One of the problems with the old Croton Aqueduct is as it began to fail, they found themselves with 3 or 4 days water on hand in this Croton Reservoir. So if they had to shut it down for repairs, they had to work very quickly in order to not deprive the citizens of water. There was very little room for error. This is the new Croton Aqueduct, also a brick structure. Some back-of-the-envelope calculations that we did shows that this 35-mile brick structure is maybe one of the largest brick structures in the world, if you actually count the square footage of brickwork in it. They increased the number of brick courses to 3 here. They thickened up the shell. As part of that Croton expansion, it also included new gatehouses at Central Park. For those of you that are cinema buffs, this gatehouse is the structure where the diamonds are dropped through the grating in Marathon Man when Dustin Hoffman is standing over it there. There are a few Waterworks moments in cinema, but this is one of the stars of it. This is a cross-section of the types of dams that were being built in the Croton. There's that original Croton Dam there with this stilling pool there. But I show this here because this is a profile of what was then being called the New Croton Dam. What's interesting about this is the scale change. They were talking about a dam that was going to be 175 feet above grade and about 115 feet below grade. So this was on a scale of engineering that was never thought about. What's interesting about this is it became possible because of the emerging science of statics and strength of materials. They could actually calculate that this dam would work, whereas all of these other dams were done more or less on an intuitive basis, trial and error. Dams have been built and failed, but they suddenly reached the point where they could begin to say, if you've got a certain amount of lateral pressure coming onto this, this is the size of the structure that you have to build. An original plan showing the watershed that would be contained by this new dam. This is a magnificent 12-foot long pen and ink drawing that shows some of the early studies for the new Croton Dam. Here you can see the length of the dam, 1,168 feet. Thickness at the base, 206 feet. It's a glorious structure. If there's one thing that you want to visit in the New York City water supply system, take a drive up to the Croton River and have a look at this dam. It's like visiting the pyramids. It is this magnificent work of masonry. And it's especially glorious in springtime when it's spilling like this. All right, let's come to the turn of the century here. I don't know if you recall, but where we left off in that last population consumption figure was 1890 with a population of about 1.5 million and a consumption rate of about 75 gallons per person per day. What happens here? Well, for one, consolidation. Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx joined New York City. So the population of New York City, which was considered Manhattan in those previous statistics, suddenly went to 4.5 million people. This consolidation was largely driven because Manhattan had it together with water infrastructure. And Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx, to a certain degree, were suffering with a lack of good water, and they were clamoring for water. Brooklyn was dependent upon groundwater out of aquifers. They were overpumping the aquifers. There was a salt encroachment, so the water quality was declining rapidly. So, and the merchants, there was a huge amount of industrial water used in Brooklyn for sugar and other industrial applications, so they were clamoring for water. And that was, at least in part, the driver for consolidation. It's interesting to know we went from 12 gallons of water per person per day when we were taking it out of wells to 75 when the old Croton came on. What also came on with the old Croton was the flush toilet. That was the beginning of indoor plumbing in New York City. So the advantages that brought to life were that we could bring extra water into our world. These figures continued to rise. This is a kind of interesting diagram. This is Aquia Claudius, one of the aqueducts of the Imperial Roman system. For all of our excitement about the Roman aqueducts and whatnot, this is maybe 18 square feet, and the archaeologists who deal with hydrology in ancient Rome, it's one of their favorite things is to argue how much water they got out of it. But the upper end of that is 25 million gallons per day out of the 7 main imperial aqueducts. Here we are at the old Croton Aqueduct, 70 million gallons per day. The new Croton Aqueduct was 250 million gallons per day. And now we're going to look at the Catskill system here quickly. I'm going through this rather quickly. This is about an hour-and-a-half lecture, but I'm trying to give you a little taste of what is bringing our drinking water to us here. This is an original study. They began to realize that the Croton watershed was tapped out between the 70 million gallons from the old Croton Aqueduct and the 200+ million gallons from the new Croton Aqueduct. And it was time to go west of the Hudson, to look west of the Hudson. So the political obstacles were overcome to going west of the Hudson, and they began to look at the Catskill Mountains. This is an original, one of the original studies of various routes that aqueducts could take to come out of a reservoir that they were planning to build near West Hurley. What's interesting about this moment in history is that the brick has fallen out of favor and concrete is being studied as a possible building material. It allowed the aqueduct to be more specifically shaped to meet the statics and stresses of the system, so you're able to use less material where you needed less material. This is actually a load test that was done to demonstrate that this aqueduct could in fact handle the loads that they were predicting. But the really interesting part of this is when the Board of Water Supply was coming on, there were 2,000 technical people employed by the City of New York studying how to collect and deliver water. And those technical people included people that were advancing the science of Portland cement. They were doing their own studies in the labs here in New York City about how to make Portland cement better. Because at that point, concrete was the wave of the future. This is how this was. This was an aqueduct that was on a natural hydrological gradient. It was basically like an enclosed river, not under pressure, just flowing downhill. I think about at the rate of a foot per mile. I have to check that. Is that about right, Al? Foot per mile? There it is. And then they would cover this up, a technique called cut and cover. Some of the dam construction that's associated with this is called the Olive Bridge Dam. It's interesting that they had their strategies for how they accommodated the flooding of the river while the dam was built. So at the very end of the day, when all was said and done, they came in and they did a gigantic concrete plug. But during the whole construction, they had to maintain the flow of the Esopus through that gate there. It also involved a whole portfolio of magnificent support structures, also in kind of emerging modern language of reinforced concrete. The big technical challenge was how to get the water across the Hudson River. They considered many options: laying a pipe on the bottom of the river, building a bridge which could hold the aqueduct. At the end of the day, they determined that the best way to get the longest lasting system was to go into deep rock tunneling and go substantially below the fossil bottom of the old river. What they didn't know is that the fossil bottom of the old river was really deep. There's the actual river right there. These are all probes that were made into the riverbed to try to determine where the bedrock was. They kept failing with these probes. They devised a scheme that they would build a vertical shaft on either side and drill diagonally, and they felt like if they could make those diagonal points meet in hard bedrock, that they could safely conclude that they were below the old historic bottom here. This was deep rock tunneling on of a scale never imagined before. They're down at 1,000 feet here approximately, elevation minus 1,134 feet, so you have a huge amount of water coming into it. Just the technical logistics of blowing all of that out. It's also a good story, more than I have time for here. The studies of the geology and preparation for this, there's up in Jerome Park in the Bronx, there is an entire building devoted to the core samples of the geology of New York City that were collected by the Board of Water Supply of virtually every place that they were going to build. That is the roughed-in tunnel going under the Hudson River. There were some other innovations that came with the Catskill system. This was a time when they were moving from wrought iron pipe to pipe made with rolled steel plate. And the rolled steel plate was able to go to a larger dimension and deal with larger internal pressures. So even though it was an aqueduct that was running on a natural hydrological gradient, if they reached a valley, they would drop through the valley with a pressure siphon. And that's why they had to go to a steel pipe that was more about dealing with outward pressures than the inward pressures. Those steel pipes were polished up. This is all still in service. Also, innovations in dam construction. One of the things that they learned, how am I doing? Okay, I've got to move on. All right, let me just share a few images here. These are 12-ton bronze valves. They continued to expand westward into the Delaware River watershed. At that point, the aqueducts all switched to deep rock aqueducts, high-pressure deep rock aqueducts, 600 feet below the surface. Contemporary construction involves tunnel boring machines. Infrastructure construction still goes on with New York City. It's nearly 175 years of continuous, uninterrupted building of water supply infrastructure, water treatment infrastructure. There has been a huge commitment to it. Here we are, population, consumption rates. We're getting up to 190 gallons per day. This is some of the new third water tunnel that is basically providing some redundancy to the major legs that deliver water here. These are stainless steel valves up in the Van Cortlandt valve chamber. So there's a kind of recap. Manhattan, the Croton watershed, the first phase of the Catskill watershed, the eastern Catskill. The second phase we call the Delaware system on the western side. A map of the primary drainages. That is a kind of record of this project. So, lessons learned from the system. One, to rely on science. It was, cholera was not a result of airborne bacteria. Cholera was a result of waterborne bacteria. A lot of people did not believe that for a long time. Gather and support across the full range of stakeholders and find proper funding. It took a long time to get New Yorkers to agree. They had to get the business community and the wealthy people to agree to fund the Waterworks system. Very important, I would say, a lesson from different parts of the world to keep civic water resources in public hands. There's been a lot of effort. There was consideration in the 70s to sell the New York City water supply. Al will be able to talk about that. Invest in quality, commit to the best available design, technology, and engineering, and think long term. They love to say, the Waterworks guys love to say, I believe in the future of New York City. I'm building it. This structure is going to be here in 100 years. That's what they tell you up in the Van Cortlandt valve chamber. So at that, I'm going to hand it over to Al Appleton, who was the commissioner of this water system for a while in the 1990s. Thank you.
Okay, before I start my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about Kevin and how I met Kevin. When I was commissioner, one of the things that I kind of look back on fondly is I was the only commissioner in the history of the water system to fully fund maintenance. And I went around rooting around about problems. One of the problems I found is that we had this marvelous set of engineering records, drawings are really works of art, historical stuff, the samples Kevin talked about, and they're going to rot in hell because the Budget Bureau thought it wasn't worth money spending on preserving these things. So I had basically decided I was going to have to go up that mountain and kick a few butts. And just at this time when I'm figuring out how I'm going to do this, Kevin shows up, fresh from his success in rescuing the records of the old Department of Docks, which are an invaluable history of the city's waterfront. And he and I formed an alliance, and I got Kevin the initial money. He spent 8 years salvaging the archives of the New York City water system, which is a huge piece of work, which he's never gotten the public acknowledgement or credit he should have gotten for this legacy he's contributed to the city. So what you saw there and what you would see in the book Waterworks he was referring to is the record of really an incredible accomplishment to the history of design and engineering and civic activity in the city of New York. And I, for one, am incredibly grateful that he did it. Now, looking over the resumes, I'm the only person speaking who's ever actually run a water system. So I'm going to kind of talk about it from that perspective. But I have to say, this has been such a meaty and such a concept-rich presentation. I really wish I'd seen some of it beforehand because I'd love to alter my narrative and kind of grapple with with some of the ideas that have been presented here. But I am actually going to talk about a couple of things as starters, just to get them off my chest. The first of all is this is about sustainability. The story of the New York City water system is a story about sustainability. We're all talking here is about sustainability, the blue-green economy, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I teach a course in sustainability, and the first thing I tell you is sustainability is not a checklist. It's not a list of nice green things you do or you add to something you do. Sustainability has got to be a fundamental change in the way we run the economic life of the planet. It's a fundamental change that is based on, I submit, two things. First of all, we have to learn to work in collaboration and harmony with nature. The way ecologies work has an incredible amount to teach us about value and wealth and efficiency. And the second thing sustainability is about, in my view, is capturing the wealth that is lost through environmental mismanagement. And I'll talk a little bit more about it. The question was asked at the end of the last panel, what is the green economy? The advice I give people is read Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is a wonderful book on how to run a green economy. So I like to tell my business audiences, Wealth of Nations is not entitled How to Maximize Corporate Profits. It's talking about how to maximize the wealth that all of us has. It's really an essay in distributive justice. It's an essay about how you value things, how you conserve things, how you create wealth. And we will do very well if we follow that. Now, I also have a quick comment I want to make about the 5,000-pound life. I think it's a wonderful concept, and I think it's extraordinarily valuable that's being put forward, but it hides an issue. The issue it hides is whether or not in addressing global warming, we are going to be able to accommodate some fossil fuel use, or we're going to have to get out of fossil fuel use entirely. I'm not going to go into my own personal views on this, but I tend to favor the latter for reasons of political ecology, to use a term I heard earlier. But we have to, at some point, we're going to have to make that decision as a society, as a species, and a culture. And the 5,000-pound life points to why it is important to make that decision, but we can't take that as the final word on what the decision is. Now, I really love the comment of the Skidmore Owens Merrill person, forgive me for forgetting your name, about why don't we have more people living in the Great Lakes. I was born in Los Angeles, but every time I go there, I think God did not mean 10 million people who live in this basin. I have the same feeling when I work in the Everglades in Miami. God did not intend 7 million people to live south of Orlando. We as a culture have developed a habit of believing that where we want to do, we will bring water and other natural resources to it. The real question is in the area of the Anthropocene as opposed to the Holocene, whether or not we're going to be able to continue to organize our society on the basis of that premise, or if sustainability really regards us to think about those very, very large-scale questions. Now, Stephanie said we don't have a water shortage, we actually have a shortage of water management. I completely agree. I'm often asked in my foreign consulting, do you think there's a water crisis? I said, no, there's a crisis of water management. I can think of maybe 3 places on the globe where they may actually run out of water. One is the Yellow River Valley, 2 is a couple of places in India, and 3 actually may be Southern California. But we will come back to that. On the other hand, I heard someone say that government doesn't have the bandwidth to deal with these issues. I find that an unacceptable conclusion. Government is the way we act socially. It's the way we act collectively, the way we act together. Part of the design problem is the institutional design problem of how do we create an ecology in government that can make these decisions in the right way? How do we get everybody at the table? We need to make these decisions, and how do we reference through them? Lastly, I heard a nice suggestion that we confiscate all the water rights in California. I believe in expropriation, too, for the public interest. Although I have a tactical hint, I often found that threatening is actually a better way to get something done than actually trying to do it. Okay, slide 1, where are we? When I became commissioner in 1990, the wonderful era of engineering that Kevin had described had really come to its logical end, and we were getting to a new era, transition from building all this wonderful infrastructure to managing it. And this is a transition that all infrastructure agencies have been going through in this country in the last 30 years, and it's a transition that's fundamental to sustainability. It's a transition sometimes referred to as soft path, hard path, but I don't like that because I don't like the ideological tone behind it. Basically, for me, sustainability is an economic issue. It's not an ideological issue. And the way to get the sustainable solutions is to look at the economics. Stephanie? Okay, now, we had 3 fundamental decisions as a water system in the early 1990s. The first was our water was always unfiltered mountain water, and that's because of the tradition of going very far north. We first built the Croton system before they had any practical ways of treating water. The only way to get pure water was to go to some place that had it and was likely to continue to have it. The second thing, as you saw in Kevin's chart, the water use had gone to 191 gallons per day per capita in New York City. We were 200 million gallons a day over safe yield and was going up 2% a year. Now, did we need to build a new waterworks complex, which would cost $5 billion for reasons I will explain, to solve this? And the last thing was the cost of all of these items, $4.6 billion, $5 billion. There was also taking sludge out of the ocean, nitrogen in Long Island, upgrading our sewage treatment. We were looking at an enormous amount of bills that were hitting our poor populations very hard because we had begun to meter our water system. But the folklore in those days was that wealthy people used more water than poor people. Our metering showed just the opposite. Because poor people doubled up, they're unemployed, they're at home, they were using much more water. And that the rise in water bills, which is going 15% a year for 7 years, was threatening the economic viability of those populations to housing that served them. Okay, so avoiding filtration. The watershed, as I said, had been pristine water, but three things were happening in the 80s. Industrialization of watershed agriculture was taking place in an attempt to compete with subsidized agriculture elsewhere. Vacation home development had discovered the Catskills, and the city had a record of indifference to watershed environmental issues. Keeping with its engineering tradition, it felt the watershed was big enough to absorb any insult, and we should basically keep our hands off for political reasons. So the choice was watershed protection, which I figured would cost about 10% of building the filtration plant, or build the filtration plant. Now, I'm often asked by people, how did you make this decision? Meaning, what studies did you do? What experts did you call in? The truth of the matter is I made the decision in 5 minutes. It was a no-brainer to decide that if we could do something that would cost 10% and help the environment, we were a lot better off than sinking $5 billion into concrete and steel. The issue was, could it be done? The most universal consensus from EPA, CDC, public health, and in many of the environmental community was no. This is a tree hugger's dream, to quote one statement to me. And why is this? Because, first of all, the record of the past in the United States in controlling agricultural pollution was terrible. And two, to quote a famous person who I will not name because you would know him, no force on earth can control American real estate development. Close quote. All right, so the key step we did to make this happen is we switched from a regulatory top-down approach after a few mistaken steps. I have a very good paper that kind of describes the social history of this for those who are interested. And we switched to a collaborative approach with the agricultural people based on mutual self-interest, defined as we're up here to get clean water, not run a regulatory system. You guys want to keep farming in business. So how do we do both of these things together? We developed a program called Whole Farm Planning that the city funded and the farmers would run, in which basically the environmental measures were integrated with the business activities of the farm. For example, manure management in dairy farming was a huge time business. By essentially giving them the kind of infrastructure to do manure management properly, we freed up an hour to 2 hours a day for the average dairy farmer. It was huge in selling the program. Now, the critical question was, how did we get political mass? Because those of you who've been involved with non-point source pollution programs know that basically they tend to be voluntary, and they are left in the hands of... Basically, the farmers who wanted to run the program, they understood I had to have critical mass, but they said from a farm perspective, this has to be voluntary. It's a political deal breaker. So we went back and forth. There were some wonderful leaders in the farm community that wanted to solve this problem. Finally, once again, there were no studies, it just kind of clicked one day. I basically said to them, here's the deal. I will make this program voluntary for any individual farmer, but you who are running it have to get me 85% participation of all farmers in the watershed within 5 years. Or otherwise, except I'll hold harmless those who join, I get to go back to traditional regulation. Actually, I finally remember the leader of the farmers getting the kind of thinking about this from getting a twinkle in his eye and said, "Would you take 80?" And I said, "No, I wouldn't. You guys made out like a bandit in this program. 85 is for me." So we got critical mass within the political culture of farming in a way that helped the farming landscape, that certainly beat the real estate developed landscape, and off we went. Now, I want to stress, though, the urban-rural farm collaboration is often the story of this program. It became famous worldwide as a model of ecosystem services. Emma, next slide. Oops. Oh, nice farm picture. Excellent. Keep going.
I tried to dress it up a little for you.
Love it. Love it. As you can see here, the farm is down in the valley next to the stream. Keep going. Oops, nope, keep going. Okay, oops, nope, back. Back. All right, anyway, we'll find the slide. This was a comprehensive program that actually had 12 elements to it. 6 were to eliminate existing pollution, and 6 were designed to make sure it did not grow back. Did we find it? No, not yet. There we are. There we are. No, this is a conservation program. Okay. All right. Well, I guess we're going to have to skip the brilliant 12-point program. But the point is, the ag program was not the only part of the program. We developed, working with communities for what we called water-compatible economic development. We did stream restoration. We funded septic restoration. We dealt with pollution hotspots. We had watershed regulations. We bought up critical sites to prevent development. All of this ultimately cost the city of New York about $1 billion over 20 years, as opposed to $5 billion a year and $200 million a year to operate it. And it helped the environment. One of the things my budget bureau wanted me to do was to essentially to just aim for whatever pollution threats they thought EPA would deal with. We explicitly rejected that proposal. Our strategy was a good environment means good water. So as you can see from those items, essentially we set out to gold plate the watershed environment, and we succeeded. Now, the next problem was we were running out of drinking water again. We're running out of water upstate, so the proposal was from the traditionalists to build a new waterworks about 100 miles north here on the Hudson River. That waterworks would cost $2 billion. My one claim to fame on this issue is at a staff meeting I said, can someone tell me what this is going to do to our sewage treatment capacity? Because we were at 7 of our 8 major sewage treatment plants were within that 5% of capacity. Well, it turns out, believe it or not, nobody had thought of this. This was called holistic thinking. The water people's job was to bring it in. It reminded me of the old rhyme, I send them up where they come down, someone else's department, says Werner von Braun. It was a failure of holistic analysis. This is like a human body. What goes in must come out. More water use means more sewage treatment. 2 sewage treatment plants, $1.5 billion each. And then, of course, there was the political issue of going out to some lovely community and said, you are the lucky winners of a $1.5 billion new sewage treatment plant. Once I got that realization sunk into the real estate community, who was beginning to worry about sewage treatment capacity for limiting development, we had that was kind of that politically decisive event. We had kind of a new perspective on water conservation. So we got around the people disparaging water conservation with it was less controversial, cheaper, faster, and would make sure you did not run into any development objectives. Now, the key to making water conservation work in the city was we were comprehensive. I've seen an awful lot of water conservation programs in my time. They all tend to go after whatever element is fashionable in the conservation world at that particular point in time. They don't kind of say, we want to get to X amount of water use. How do we hierarchically arrange the elements and just walk down them? Emma? So we started by the first element is saving water in our own system. We did a very aggressive program to eliminate leaks. Another thing we did is spend a lot of money on new staff to manage system valving, because we were losing a lot of water through misvalving the system, particularly because we didn't have the meters necessary to monitor it properly. And we did hydrant locks. I was a little concerned when I heard that Chicago is still in an arms war, because we solved our hydrant locks war 20 years ago. And if you look at those little, if you're in the right neighborhood and you look at those little things that look like cardinals' miters on top of our hydrants, those are the hydrant locks. Now, how did we deal with the community demand that we were, summer, no air conditioning? We essentially set up a program where you could go to a police precinct and sign out a essentially a sprinkler cap for a hydrant. You would choose as 5% of the water, but get you about 50% of the effect. So that ultimately provided 20% of the ultimate water savings, and I tell water utilities when I consult with them, that's all free water. I'm going to hear a lot from water utilities that if we conserve water, we're going to sell less water, we're going to be out of money. I say if you conserve your own water, it's all free money. You get to say that. Now, the other thing we did is we went after consumer water use. We went with metering and we went with charging, but we did a lot of other stuff. We did free water audits for every building. We did technical assistance for people finding leaks and problems and for essentially managing their water bills. We provided a huge amount of conservation education for the system. What happened to the rebate program? It got off here.
It's on the next slide.
Oh, the next slide. Okay, and then we did rate systems. We introduced ascending block grant rates. We also introduced rate systems that essentially capped rates, particularly, which is very important for low-income housing, when we were dealing with people would meet certain conservation targets, usually by taking our rebate program and having water-saving technology. Emma? Oops, okay, now we've forgotten the toilet rebate. The biggest thing we did is we changed out 1.5 million toilets. There's 4 million toilets in New York, if you're interested in this trivia. In 18 months. We spent $350 million in it. It was the biggest cost item of the conservation program. We worked with the Plumbing Foundation as a genuine, that oft-abused term, public-private partnership, in this case, was a real reality. That saved us over 100 million gallons a day of water alone. Okay, so we got, in the first 2 years, we had 250 million gallons a day of usage, 400 million gallons a day. Today, we're 400 million gallons a day below that 1990 figure you saw, Kevin. It was a no-drama success, unlike the Watershed, which was a great story, public-private, farmers and urbanites being friends. This was actually, no one ever noticed we were doing this, except the building operators who were saving money. Now, there's a huge extra benefit in doing this. We freed up an enormous amount of sewage treatment capacity. That sewage treatment capacity went to take stormwater. So that much of the key of the success of the city's stormwater system, I don't want to underestimate our SCADA program, nevertheless came from the fact that we got 300 to 400 million gallons a day more capacity in our sewer system. Okay, so this program is another paradigm of sustainability and a testimony to comprehensive planning and the fact that we were able to create the right institutional framework and financial incentives. One of my key messages about sustainability is you pay for sustainability by the money you make from sustainability. And we made a lot of money in these two programs. Emma? Okay, now ending water rates and developing consumer consciousness. Water rates are growing 15% a year, engineering mindset. The agency and the budget bureau that supervised it had a kind of a cost-plus mindset. And when we did some institutional reforms in the 1980s, they kind of ran wild with the funding. And frankly, this is a mindset that water engineers have only imperfectly transitioned out of. Unfortunately, many water utilities are very badly run economically and financially, but that's a different presentation. Go on, Emma. Okay, now we did some things that are important. First of all, we used natural, or what we call natural, or what is now called green infrastructure. Our biggest program there was the Staten Island Blue Belt, where we essentially took 10 stream corridors, now raised to 19, and essentially preserved them, not as open swales, but as functioning stream and wetland systems. They solved the stormwater problem on southern Staten Island, saved us $300 million in stormwater construction and are now part of the official drainage system of the sewage treatment system. Now, the other thing which is often ignored, and this gets in sustainability analysis, asset optimization. The key step was full maintenance funding. I want to tell two quick stories for you sustainability buffs. When we fully funded the maintenance of the sewage treatment plants, the operators of those plants were able to optimize the plant operation the way they were never able to do so when they were stuck with staff shortages and taking shortcuts. We got so much improvement in the effluent quality that it became the equivalent of building, under the old conditions, a new 150 million gallon a day sewage treatment plant. When we had to take sludge out of the ocean, we built sludge dewatering plants. Those dewatering plants were designed to pull water out at 22 to 24%. I gave them 72 people to maintain those extra over what the Budget Bureau wanted to maintain those plants. With that extra staffing, they were able to take the performance of those plants up from 29 to 32% dewatering. Now, since water weighs 8 gallons a pound, and since we were paying to ship that sludge cake out by weight, we saved $15 to $20 million for the cost of those 72 people. A great part of when we come to talk about sustainable infrastructure, we tend to think too much about what we're going to build, even if it's soft path infrastructure, and not enough how we're going to run it and how we're going to maintain it. Okay, now, attack regulatory, go back 1 second. There are a lot of regulatory mandates that misallocate investment. I hate to say this about my own movement, but the environmental movement can be pretty stubborn and pretty non-fact-based and pretty emotional about things like clean water standards, trade-offs between air and water pollution, land use and its impact on pollution. There are a lot of dumb mandates that are extremely expensive. The city of New York, after I left and was not there to kind of kick them in the teeth, spent $2 billion on upgrading Newtown Creek for the equivalent of essentially 3 points in improvement in the water column. Now, what could you have done with that $2 billion? You could spend $500 million on cutting the top off of Newtown Creek and $1 billion paying for comprehensive restoration of the estuary and the construction of hundreds of wetlands. These are the kinds of choices, if we're going to be sustainable, we have to ask about our own environmental biases, about our own environmental thinking. When are we doing the most cost-effective, environmentally effective thing? And lastly, of course, is optimized revenue. There's a lot of money water systems, environmental systems leave on the table from their charging systems. Sustainability is an economic proposition. All right, so we got the water rates to zero for 2 years, below inflation for the next 9. We hired 600 more people, something I'm very proud of. Sustainability is about employment, about social opportunities. We greatly improved our utility operations, and because we were saving money, we got stronger political support for when we actually had to spend it for some of our environmentally innovative programs. Sustainability means wise resource use, which often means many small steps, not the dramatic stuff. Ooh, it looks like a little natural infrastructure. Keep going.
That's your bluebell, pal.
Yes, bluebell slides, excellent. Okay. All right, the water system today and global warming and energy use. Our water system has a very small carbon footprint, so small that we've not bothered to measure it, probably a mistake, but nevertheless. It's 97% gravity. Indeed, for those of you who like these kinds of design trivia, the reason brownstones in New York are 5 stories high is 5 stories high is the height to which the Croton head, the hydraulic head, could raise water reliably. Some days it could get to 6 or 7, but if you lived on the 6th floor, there'd be bad days. 5 stories. The reason our brownstones are 5 stories high in New York, when we had I lived through my first blackout, my girlfriend lived in, now my wife, I might add, lived in a high-rise. I lived in a brownstone, so I walked down 70 blocks through the dark and then took her home back, and we had at least water for the next 24 hours. Got it. Now, we have energy use in our sewage treatment plants, but we actually are doing a lot to reduce that by internally generated biogas and the use of hydro on our, retrofitting our dams for hydro. So it's a very aggressive and sustainable system with respect to energy use. Now, because we are now 200 million gallons a day below safe yield, with the success of our water conservation program, as opposed to 200 million gallons a day above, water use in the city is down to about 1 billion gallons a day, and still trending lower. We have enormous resiliency. We can ride out any probable precipitation changes from climate. Now, the projections for the Northeast are more precipitation and more storms. We used to get most of our water from melted snow. Now we get most of it from storm events. That does have a complication, which is avoiding downstream flooding when we were managing our reservoirs. During Hurricane Irene, some mistakes were made, and there were some bad consequences for people, downstream of some of our dams. Sewage treatment sewage treatment is a bit different story. Obviously, our 14 treatment plants are all on the shoreline. They have varying degrees of vulnerability to a storm like Sandy or to hurricanes. They need to be armored. They probably can't be moved because the system's designed to send all the sewage there, but that's going to be a cost. The biggest problem in the future is probably going to be our storm sewer outlets. They're 3.5 feet above mean high tide. 24 feet of ocean rise is predicted by 2100. Long before we get that, in high tides or storm events, we'll begin to see backflow in those storm sewers. We're probably going to have to retrofit some of those things quite expensively. Miami, for those of you who are interested, have just decided it's going to have to spend $300 million retrofitting its storm sewers because they're already getting tidal invasion. I love the fact, though, that in Miami, the real estate community, this is why people say no force on earth can withstand it, say this is proof that Miami Beach, 5 feet high, will live through global warming just fine. Good. Okay. Right now, now, the water system today and global warming energy. So what role should our water system have in dealing with these things? Now, a 4-foot ocean rise projected by 2100 will take out 25% of New York City. That's the problem. People do not understand that a third of New York City is built on filled land, and much of this land is at or even below sea level. I had to do a couple of projects to pump up sewage because they were in communities that were below sea level on Jamaica Bay. Now, how to address this? First of all, the best thing that I think the water system could do is be both a source of capital and leadership for a comprehensive estuary restoration. That is, after Sandy, every dog who had a project, an oyster bank here, a storm sewer here, a barrier reef here, came out of their woodwork and said, we need to have these projects done to help protect the city in the future. I believe in nature. I think if we I think our best thing in the estuary is to put the estuary back in the shape nature had it, with the resiliency it had. That would cost $1 to $2 billion. We did a plan 10 years ago, citizen-based plan for this. The Army Corps of Engineers has ignored it. The federal budget, things have changed it. This has to be done. Now, the next thing, of course, is that nature restoration saves carbon. Carbon is a resource that ecologies hoard. Next to water, it's the most important ecological resource there is. Healthy native ecologies, or what I like to call reference ecologies, are huge for carbon. There's big roles for nature in the city of New York, not just mentioning wetlands and fisheries, but essentially the natural areas within parks. We could do a lot in that. We need to integrate climate concerns into capital planning, particularly DEP's coastal investment. One of the things that I can see politically coming down the road is because we have such a large water surplus and the suburban areas in particular lack the reservoir storage, we may be asked to become the water supplier of last resort for the whole downstate New York region. We're going to have to think about, if that issue comes up, how we deal with the institutional organization of that issue. Emma? Okay. That's some of the, go back to that slide, but that's some of the filled land around New York City. That map is essentially based on British survey maps during the Revolutionary War. When the British occupied New York, the British Navy surveyed the entire coastline. Their maps are a really incredible ecological resource. Go ahead. Okay, now, a few lessons and conclusions. One of the things, and both Kevin and I feel this having worked on this system, and this is a system to be very proud of. It's a system of civic success and civic achievement. Every critical moment in the history of New York, when they could have taken the easy way out, they took the long-term view. They spent the money. The only mistakes ever made on the water system, like the lack of a round-out bypass, were when they decided to go cheap. My favorite story about the building of the New York water system is when the real estate community, which was being taxed to build the Croton, came to John Jacob Astor, who's the big force in this place, Astor, and said, "You're the richest man in New York, the biggest property owner. You got to stop this Croton water system boondoggle." He said, "Well, I'd be happy to help stop any boondoggle, but in my view, New York City can never pay too much money for abundant, pure water." I am often asked when I consult overseas, well, these are great ideas, but New York City's a rich city. I tell people, how many of you have seen the movie Gangs of New York? Let's see, show of hands. Show of hands, Gangs of New York, all right. Same, you'd be amazed it's the same response overseas. I say, do you remember the scene where they fought over the water hydrant? That was a poor developing city. That poor developing city built the Croton system because it taxed the wealth of the community. That's the key to these systems, is it's tax the wealth of the community. So the New York City water system is a model for sustainable infrastructure management. We've got the power of holistic thinking. Now there's some buzzwords I just want to kind of mention in the concept of holistic thinking. One is natural or green infrastructure. There's no bigger fan of green infrastructure than I am. On the other hand, like all buzzwords, you can run away with it. For example, in New York City, we're doing a big program on that. I enjoyed the comment about going to the swells, incidentally. But it's not clear to me that if we didn't do hyper water conservation in those neighborhoods, we couldn't free up more space in the sewage treatment system better and cheaper than we can with natural infrastructure. Now, natural infrastructure has another value, which is the people love it. You know, the real estate community, when I did the Staten Island Blue Belt and took all of that land out of development, said, we'll get you when Giuliani's elected mayor. Turned out the program was so popular in Staten Island, not even Giuliani dared touch it. So you got to measure. We have failed to do the kind of correct analysis in these things of where is the holistic piece. Resiliency. Resiliency is a word we're all going to get very tired of very soon. But what I don't like about resiliency is the suggestion that if we're resilient, we can deal with all of these consequences. That is, we will be able to design systems that will outride Sandy, that outride 5 years of drought in California. They'll outrun the fact that the Great Lakes are going to shrink under any global warming. The idea of resiliency does not help us deal with the kind of reconciliation we are going to have to deal with in terms of what global precipitation is going to do to us. You heard it here first. The water energy nexus. I too believe in that, particularly having worked in the Yellow River in China, where they're essentially selling out irrigation for coal production, and because of my experience with the gas fracking issue. Consumer disclosure, I spent a lot of time in that. I could claim some credit for getting Cuomo to ban the damn stuff in this state, and we're going to get banned in this And we're going to get banned in eastern Pennsylvania and the Delaware River Basin, too. But the water agriculture nexus is still much more important for the future of both water and the planet. Agriculture, 40% of agriculture production worldwide comes from the 18% of the land that's irrigated. If we took 1/4 of the water away from agriculture in California, we would have a totally different view of the California water problem. So the most water use in this country in the world goes for agriculture. That's the real question where the future of water lies, and the future of our food system as well. Now, sustainability, as I said earlier, is about economics and it's about recapturing the money lost to environmental abuse by externalizations. We all know that global warming is the grossest externalization around, but there's also subsidies and perverse incentives. Hopefully everyone in this audience knows about what coastal flood insurance does to coastal zone development. There's lots of that stuff. The federal budget is riddled with that stuff. We could rescue $100 billion there alone, not to mention what we get out of the Farm Bill. And misguided mandates, which I mentioned. Emma? Okay, last two final thoughts. Design. I see two roles for design. One is bringing elegance of simplicity and economy to our engineered infrastructure. And the second is reconciling the needs of our communities, particularly communities that have developed in ways in the past that we would no longer allow them to develop today, with the environmental constraints of the present. Now, what role would I like for, how did I use design as a commissioner? Basically, design was the source of ideas. Cutting-edge designers give you possibilities. We need those possibilities to illuminate public debate. Just as we need cutting-edge engineering, we need cutting-edge economics, we need cutting-edge institutional things. We need the designers at the table telling us what are the possibilities as we do these things. Okay, now lastly, I will say that if we want to create the water utility of the future, our goal should be to make water utilities bioregional managers. I say this for two reasons. First of all, watersheds remain the logical unit in which to manage a water system. John Wesley Powell, in his wonderful books in the 80s, basically proposed that states in the West be organized around watersheds. It's a terrific idea, and it was a huge mistake not to do it. The other thing, of course, is that there was some talk about connectivity, intellectual and emotional. I found from the watershed battles in New York City that people love the idea of watershed. It gives them a sense of place. It gives them a sense of biological reality. It was an enormous key to us that people in the civic community now understand that New York City gets its water from a watershed. We have a relationship to it, and it is extremely important that we cherish that relationship. The reason this city responded so hard to the gas fracking proposal is the original people said we could do gas fracking in the watershed, which is a pretty horrible idea. So, I think that's it. As I said, I would have loved to engage with many of the interesting conceptual ideas from our earlier speakers.
Well, we have another 45 minutes here to talk as a panel, Al.
But basically, I hope this gives you some sense of what you can do for sustainability with the right directions for your water utility. Thank you.